I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. It's time to take a look at topic 12.2 as we continue to look at World War I. As you know, the United States attempted to stay out of the war as long as possible. President Wilson had declared a policy of neutrality and was following isolationism. But as we move forward, we're going to see how the United States got involved and impacted World War I. Some of the objectives that we're looking at in 12.2. How did the United States mobilize public support for the war effort? We'll see opposition in the United States to the war and see how the United States government dealt with that. We'll look at the causes and effects socially of migration in the country during this period of time as well. Remember, you should have out your Google Doc opened up to the questions and fill them out as we go through it. So prior to World War I, what role did the federal government play in the daily lives of most Americans? How is this going to change during World War I? From the founding of our country after the Revolutionary War through World War I, the United States pretty much stayed out of the lives of most Americans. However, during the war itself, the government assumed new powers with price controls, strict censorship, rationing, a military draft, and propaganda. If you look at the poster there, that's a typical propaganda poster from World War I. Uncle Sam there depicted. I want you underlined and bolded. Enlist in the U.S. Army was the motivating factor there. Trying to instill patriotism in citizens as well. People believed during this period of time that the country needed their help to succeed in the war effort. One of the positive things that President Wilson did is kind of made it a group effort, a collective national effort to help out, both on the war front and also on the home front. In addition to those who served in the war, citizens at home produced the food that soldiers ate, the guns that the soldiers used to fight, the uniforms that they wore. The media, unlike today, which has got many different avenues to present information, during this period of time, it was primarily the print media and a little bit with radio. But during this period of time, the media worked with the government to keep everybody on the war footing and supporting the war. 4, how did the Selective Service Act provide the needed soldiers for the war effort? Wilson encouraged Americans to volunteer to serve in the armed forces, but he quickly realized this would not be enough in regard to the number of soldiers needed to fight in the war. This 1917 act required all young men to register for military service. Soldiers were assigned draft numbers, and the Secretary of War pulled out number 258 from the jar. And the first group of young men became the nation's first draftees. Looking at the Selective Service Act today, does it still require young men age 18 or older to register for the draft? They do. So all the young men in the class, once you turn 18, you're required to register with the Selective Service Department. You're issued a Selective Service number. And the draft's not current right now. It's not an active draft, but in the case of a national emergency or another war effort, the United States could quickly call up those who are part of the database, and the Selective Service Act helps us to organize all our citizens. I still have my own Selective Service number. And let's say we're really in a dramatic or drastic war, and all of a sudden that they are looking for washed up men in their 50s they could eventually get to Mr. Clarke's draft number. 6 many World War I soldiers were drafted. How did the fact that they were drafted impact the way the government handled the war? Since about half of the soldiers in World War I were not volunteers, the government needed to work hard to ensure public support for the war effort. They used the Committee on Public Information to release propaganda to promote the war effort. Court-martialed men who avoided or refused to register for the draft. Also, during the war effort, too, the United States needed to increase productivity and the production of food, fuel, weapons, and other supplies for not only our army, but also for our allies who are also fighting the war in Europe. The government set prices for food to encourage farmers to grow more food. Government officials figured out how to transport food, fuel, and other products and how much was needed. It was a very coordinated effort. Because these supplies were not regulated by the regular supply-demand markets, the government had to oversee everything to make sure we had the proper supplies for the war effort. Eight, who was Bernard Barak? Barak explained his role in the war effort. He was a Wall Street investment banker. He was put in task and in charge of running the War Industries Board. The WWI set production goals, established the price controls. During World War I, the free market capitalistic economy that the United States is based on took kind of a back seat for national interest during the time of a war. Who? Hoover, Herbert Hoover. That's who we'll be looking at next. His position was very similar to Bernard Barak's, except instead of doing industry like Barak did, Hoover was in charge of the Food Administration. He applied many of the WIB techniques and applied it to food production. He encouraged Americans to conserve. He said it was very patriotic to conserve food on the home front. He even developed clever ways of doing so. Put out a calendar with wheatless Mondays and Wednesdays, meatless Tuesdays, porkless Thursdays and Saturdays. And as a result, this is very helpful in conserving food on the home front. George Creel, he was a former journalist. He was appointed by President Wilson to head up the Committee on Public Information. This helped to coordinate propaganda. This includes posters, pamphlets, press releases, all designed to sell America on the war itself. In that visual, you can see a wide variety of propaganda ideas. Bottom left, you can see the sinking of a ship, maybe the Lusitania, kind of advocating the idea if we don't do something about that, we could lose more ships and citizens. We see a smiling soldier up top left. Top right, education for you, kind of working on heavy equipment. Kind of patriotic uniform person riding an eagle there. So definitely a situation where they were trying to promote the war. Propaganda was also used on the other side of the Atlantic during the war, as the Allies tried to keep their soldiers and their citizens on the war effort. Another thing that was done too is the British and the French, even prior to American involvement in World War I, was putting out anti-German propaganda to try and convince the Americans to get in the war on the side of the Allies. 12. How were pacifists and conscientious objectors treated during World War I? Pacifists and conscientious objectors were treated poorly. Their concerns often ignored. You were considered to be unpatriotic if you opposed the war, treasonous. Their beliefs were not respected. Many in the government were fearful of widespread opposition to the war, breaking down the war effort itself. Next, we'll look at the positive and negatives of the Committee on Public Information. Obviously, you can think of these pretty logically. Positive with some of the educational aspects, promoted patriotism and unity on the home front. Negative, it exaggerated actions of the enemies, particularly the Germans, did not welcome open debate. So some traditional American freedoms, like freedom of speech, were quelled during World War I. To further restrict Americans, as we look at 14, this further restricted freedoms of Americans. The government passed the Espionage Act, which compromised the freedom of the press, punished activities that were considered treasonous during the war. Secondly, the Sedition Act made it illegal, and I'm not talking about a sick bird, illegal to speak against the government, which compromised the freedom of speech. Now, not all Americans sat by and accepted this, so it was challenged in the Supreme Court. The case was Schenck versus the United States in 1919. And obviously, the United States is a defendant in this case. The court ruled that in times of crisis or need, that certain First Amendment rights or protections no longer apply. So this ruled in favor of the American government and the restrictions it was placing on freedom of speech. Restrictions on American freedoms is not unique to World War I. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus rights, which is the right to a speedy trial if accused of a crime. He wanted to maintain law and order, so some Americans just sat in prison during a long period of time during the Civil War. Franklin Roosevelt, as you'll learn about next year, he put Japanese American citizens, these are citizens no different than anybody else in our country, into internment camps in the interest of safety during World War II. More recently, after the September 11th attacks in 2001, George W. Bush's administration passed the Patriot Act, which gave the government increasing rights to infringe upon individual citizens' freedoms and was more intrusive in the interest of protecting us. What was the national sentiment towards Germans during the war? Americans vilified Germany during the war, believing that the Germans were cruel and abusive. Anti-German sentiment was so strong and extreme that we began renaming traditional German items and things in our country. For example, Dachshunds, which is a German breed of dog, and the German measles, renamed Liberty Pups and Liberty Measles. People who defended Germany were called treasonous. Some German Americans were beaten, harassed, and even killed. How did World War I impact the women's suffrage movement? Well, women were already instrumental in helping out on the home front, joining the workforce, filling in for men who were off fighting in the war. They proved themselves to be capable, and in some cases even superior to their male counterparts in many male-dominated jobs. As the war progressed, President Wilson believed that giving women the right to vote, who were vital in helping us win the war, was the right thing to do. And an important amendment to know, the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, gave women the right to vote. An easy way to remember when the 19th Amendment was passed: if you look at 1920, just do 19/20. 19th Amendment passed in 1920. So we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. Okay, 19, characterize information by listing the push and pull factors that caused African Americans to move north during the Great Migration. All right, the push factors: Jim Crow laws. Obviously, if you're living in the South, you would not be very happy with the laws in the southern states. Lynchings and violence, lack of opportunity, kind of pushed people out of the southern regions. Pull factors: more opportunities, including in the meatpacking industry, automobile industries. Also, as family and friends moved north, other African Americans decided to move north as well. If you look at the visuals, you can see the arrows. You can see on the right side the yellow ones, the southeast to the northeast. Many in the south central region went into parts of the Midwest, parts of Michigan, Detroit in Michigan, St. Louis in Missouri, Chicago. And that's how we saw a shift in populations from 1916 to 1930. 20, identify and explain a push and pull factor that drove Mexicans to cross the border and settle in the U.S. Many Mexicans moved to the U.S. to escape the violence of the Mexican Revolution. Others moved because of economic opportunity and farming jobs. And then lastly, the lesson reflection. What's the most important changes that occurred in American society during the war? The first draft with the Selective Service Act. A sense of patriotism as the country came together during the war. Negatively, the federal government infringed on the rights of citizens who protested the war. Positively, African Americans moved across the country, creating a more diverse America. And women finally gained the right to vote. Until next time, hopefully you enjoyed our discussion here on American involvement and American on the home front during the war.